or like in Brazil. Yeah, but I like the area, so, but a little bit more rain would be great. But
Not going to say
not
it'd be
gonna happen.
No.
Yeah, not gonna happen. Well, good to see you and everyone else.
Morning, Bernard. How are you doing?
Doing well, thanks.
Good.
And good to see you and everyone.
Thank you. Let's begin. Thank you to all of you for being here. I think of you as panelists on the Sunday morning news programs. People look forward to seeing you and hearing you. So thank you very much. Thank you also to Forrest and Monty and Bronwyn for helping out behind the scenes. That's very, very helpful. Psalm 65, New Revised Standard Version. Praise is due to you, O God in Zion, and to you shall vows be performed, O you who answer prayer. To you all flesh shall come. When deeds of iniquity overwhelm us, you forgive our transgressions. Happy are those whom you choose and bring near to live in your courts. We shall be satisfied with the goodness of your house, your holy temple. By awesome deeds you answer us with deliverance, O God of salvation. You are the hope of all the ends of the earth and the farthest seas. By your strength you establish the mountains. You are girded with might. You silence the roaring of the seas, the roaring of their waves, the tumult of the peoples. Those who live at earth's farthest bounds are awed by your signs. You make the gateways of the morning and the evening shout for joy. You visit the earth and water it. You greatly enrich it. The river of God is full of water. You provide the people with grain, for so you have prepared it. You water its furrows abundantly, settling its ridges, softening with showers, and blessing its growth. You crown the year with your bounty. Your wagon tracks overflow with richness. The pastures of the wilderness overflow. The hills gird themselves with joy. The meadows clothe themselves with flocks. The valleys deck themselves with grain. They shout and sing together for joy. Let's begin with prayer. Dear God, it's hard for us to read a passage like that with this emphasis upon joy without thinking of Roy. Some people make guilt, some people make death, some people make meaningless the centerpiece of their theological work, but for Roy, it was joy. And he wrote about this in a scholarly way and published in academic journals about joy. So we would like to continue that heritage of being joyful. We know that happiness is overrated, but joy isn't. There's a difference. We are thankful too for Brian and Fritz, who wrote these 3 books, which have been so stimulating to us and so many others around the world. We're thankful for Brian's work as an administrator and as a researcher. We pray for him and his scientists who are seeking to find out what it is about COVID-19 that actually kills us. We know it does, but how does it go about killing us? That's where their work, and it surely is important. We thank you for Fritz and all he has meant to us professionally and personally. And we pray that he will know how much we appreciate him. Bless us now, we pray, in Christ's name, amen. Dr. Bo, Brian Bo, over to you.
Thank you, Dave. I'm getting, it disappeared. I thought I had an echo there. Let me begin as usual with my 2 assistants, and they've grown. I've got a third.
We just lost you.
I'm back again now.
Perfect.
All right, here are my two assistants. And we've got Ian Michael looking over the shoulder of Moshe. And Moshe is reading a scroll. Now, I have been criticized appropriately for having the scroll vertical. It should have been horizontal. My apologies. I know that I'm wrong here. And when I can track down the person who helped me with these cartoons, we'll try and get a horizontal scroll there. In the mind of Moshe, he's reading Genesis and he is thinking about the scene that is being spread out before him. This has been mentioned a couple of times already, but I think it would be perhaps useful to go through in a little bit more detail what Moshe pictures in his mind as he reads the scroll of Genesis, the coming into being of his reality. It looked something like this. Above Moshe's head was the firmament. It was a blue dome, sort of like an upside down spherical basin. In some kitchens, there is a hemispherical copper bowl that's used for whipping up egg whites. I'm told that the copper ions stabilize the whipped up egg whites. And if you can imagine that, but blue instead of copper colored, overhead, that is what the sky looked like to Moshe. And frankly, it's what it looks like to us. Above that was the ocean, the water, the Tehom. It had been put there by God at the time of creation because, as you will remember, when God started creation, he first divided the waters from above the dome from the waters under the dome. The waters above the dome were, of course, the waters that broke through last week at the time of the flood. That's where the waters came from. And God, with a high wind, sent them back up there again, according to the story told us in the flood. On the inside of the firmament was located the sun and the moon and the stars. And the Genesis story tells us that God set, and the word is emplaced or firmly put there, set the sun on the inside of the firmament. The ocean above the firmament connected with the primeval ocean below. And that was how the waters got divided on day 2 of creation. That's what God was about. And that's what Genesis describes. And that's what Moshe pictured in his mind. Underneath the firmament was the earth, and there were channels in the earth. They too erupted at the time of the flood, with the primeval ocean from deep down underneath. There was also the underworld, or Sheol, and then below everything else were the pillars of the earth. That's what the earth was supported on. Now, if you're going to read Genesis with the 2 explanacept mind of Moshe, this is the kind of picture, modified to your liking. This is the kind of picture that you should be seeing as you read Genesis with only 2 explanacepts in your mind. What kinds of problems do you get into if you don't do that? Well, Eduardo asked a question last week, which was a very interesting and perhaps even profound question. He said to me, he said, how can it be that the floodwaters covered the high mountains and didn't flow down and around and how could you have a local flood that covered the high mountains? Well, no problem if this is your mental picture of the reality. And this would have been the mental picture of the reality that Moshe pictured as he read Genesis. You'll see the mountains here on the horizon, and the skyline, the horizon was where the upside down rakia touched the earth. And if you fill this with water, obviously it doesn't go anywhere. It'll cover the high mountains, and gravity's no problem because the water's trapped inside the rakia. So that's the kind of problem that a person such as those of us who read Genesis now get into if we read the Genesis story with three explanacepts in mind, including nature, the regularities of nature, and gravity. So much for what was in Moshe's mind. Now, in Ian Michael's mind, when he reads Genesis, he wants to know answers to questions such as, did the whole solar system come into existence simultaneously with the universe? And Earth, he knows, is a planet. He knows it circles the sun. He lives in a thoroughly heliocentric universe, heliocentric system, because all of the planets circle the sun. Moshe, on the other hand, lived in a geocentric system. There's a chapter in book 3 in which we talk about the two cosmologies. The Bible is written from a geocentric cosmology. The sun is not the planet around which Moshe's world circled. The sun was a greater light set in the firmament, on day 4, as the biblical record states. So let's fast forward to about 500 years ago and ask the question, what did the reformers picture when they read Genesis? Now, we have a good feel for this one because one of the reformers, Martin Luther, painted a picture, or at least he had someone else paint the picture. I don't know that Martin Luther himself was an artist, in order to show us what he had in mind when he read Genesis. And it's probably worth our while to stop and think about what had happened between the time that Moshe read Genesis and the time that Luther read Genesis. Here's Luther's conception of what the Genesis story is talking about. I'll show you a slightly enlarged picture in a moment, but what I want you to picture here is that God is in control of the earth. The earth is the center of God's creation. There's no other planets. This was only about 10 years before Copernicus published his work on the heavenly spheres. And so Luther's picture was very similar to that of Moshe, but it differed in certain interesting aspects, which we'll take a look at now. Adam and Eve, obviously, sitting or ruling benignly over reality with land. This is the earth that is being referred to in Genesis, not the planet. It's the stuff on which these animals lived. And here are some mountains. And if you look above, these are the birds that are flying across the face of the firmament. And here are stars, and the stars are underneath the firmament itself, which is right here. And above it are these waters. Now, this was the mental picture that was produced in Luther's mind when he read Genesis. You can't see the sun here because it's covered up. So let's get there again. This is the frontispiece of the third and final book. And in the upper left is Moshe's world with the sun stuck on the firmament. And this is Ian Michael's world in the bottom right-hand corner with the sun as a gravity, a huge body compared to the Earth. I'm sorry that the Earth looks like it's almost as big as the sun, because we had to get it big enough we could put something on it that would make it recognizably Earth-like. But if they were drawn to scale, the Earth would be the size of an almost vanishing period in connection with the sun. So here's the full picture of Luther's understanding of Genesis. Here's the sun, it's on the firmament. Here's the moon, it's on the firmament. Here are the stars, they're on the firmament. So when you read in Genesis, the greater light, the lesser light, and the stars, instead of picturing our sun and our moon and thinking of the stars as sun-like bodies a great distance away, if we're reading it the way it would have been read by Moshe and the way in which we should be reading it, at least initially until we understand it, we should be picturing the greater light being set on the firmament here, and the lesser light being set on the firmament here, and the stars as little tiny points of light being set up on the inside of the firmament. Now there's some hydrologic problems here with this particular picture, because the rivers in Luther's time down here were connecting with the waters under the earth, and up here they're connecting with the waters that are above the earth. But this was the best that the illustrators could do of the picture that Luther had when he read Genesis. So we now have Genesis as read by Ian Michael, Genesis as read by Moshe, and Genesis as read by Luther. And in the third and final book, we talk about the differences. And in particular, we talk about things like the cosmology inherent in the Bible, and how the Bible was thought by the people who read it to confirm that cosmology, and how now Genesis is thought by the people who read it to confirm our cosmology. It's talking about the planet Earth, our sun, our moon, our stars, and therein lies the problem that causes Genesis to be in the center of the conflict between science and religion. That's my introduction. Dave, your turn next. But you're muted.
That's a splendid introduction. Thank you very much. I have just a quick, brief question before we get on into something more substantive, and that is, what is the relationship between that painting and Luther? Did he have?
I'm sorry. It's the illustration in his Bible.
Oh, it is.
Yeah. No, this is his illustration of what Genesis was talking about.
That's fascinating to me, because I read somewhere where people were saying way back in the patristic period, people had given up the idea that you've just presented. But if that were so, Luther didn't hear about it.
No, if that were so, Luther didn't hear about it. And we're talking 1533. In 1543, Copernicus published. So there was a 10-year gap between the time this drawing saw the light of day in large, in quantity. And but it's Luther's illustration of what the Genesis story was saying, and therefore I think we can take it as given that that's the mental picture that Luther must have had in his mind as he read Genesis.
That's remarkable. And do I remember correctly from last week that some people had an inkling about what Copernicus was up to, that some theologians, and they condemned it?
Oh, Luther. Well, hang on a minute. Melanchthon said the following. Let me find it for you, because it's
So he would be a generation or half a generation this side of Luther.
Yes, Melanchthon said that it was, what did Melanchthon say? Yeah, in 1543, Copernicus's book on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres appeared in print. So it was only about 10 years after Luther would have published this. And Melanchthon said, oh, here we go. Luther had heard about Copernicus' new ideas and didn't accept any of them. He thought Copernicus was spouting nonsense. Not one to mince his words, Luther called Copernicus both a fool and an astrologer, although he knew full well that Copernicus prided himself on his competence in astronomy. Luther's fellow reformer, Philip Melanchthon, agreed, quote, "The eyes are witness that the heavens revolve in the space of 24 hours, Melanchthon said, but certain men have concluded that the earth moves. Now it is a want of honesty and decency to assert such notions publicly, and the example is pernicious." How's that for a gentle? Melanchthon and Luther were not gentle when they were talking about things they disagreed with. Now, let me hasten to add that you'll notice that this was spherical, that the whole picture was a sphere. Along about 200 BC, there were Greek philosophers who pretty much had figured out that the earth was spherical and that the sun was spherical and probably the moon was spherical too. And so by the time of Luther, the earth was known to be a sphere, but it was fixed. It didn't move. So the cosmology of Luther, as he read Genesis, was the cosmology of geocentrism. The earth was fixed and it was the center of all reality. What Ian Michael reads in Genesis is that the earth is a sphere and it goes around a sun that is immeasurably larger than the earth. And so the cosmology has changed. And it was this, as much as whether or not the earth itself moved, that bothered the reformers and the people of that era, because it demoted the earth from the center of all reality to a small planet circling a third-rate sun in the outer reaches of one of the 100 million galaxies that we now know exist. But note that the earth in Luther's time had become circular, but it was still the center of the universe.
Okay, that helps me a lot. And so why do they call it pernicious? I guess it's because the demotion of the earth.
It's pernicious because they knew that the heavens revolve in the space of 24 hours. Notice it's not the earth turning. It's the heavens revolving in the space of 24 hours. I just thought it would be interesting to go through history and look at the mental pictures that people who, theologians yet, who read Genesis, and we assume read it with great care, the different mental pictures that they had as they read the same text.
Yeah, I think that's been very, very helpful. So with that in mind, let's turn more directly to your third book. And I'll begin by asking, when you started your first book, did you anticipate having a second book? And when you started your second book, did you anticipate having a third one?
No, we thought we could. We thought that this task was a lot simpler than it turned out to be, and that we could solve all problems and identify where the divide between science and Genesis was coming from, and we could do it all in the space of a fairly small book. but it turned out that we were wildly optimistic.
Well, that's to our benefit. The title of the book is God, Genesis, and Good News. And then the subtitle is quite similar: God, the Misreading of Genesis, and the Surprisingly Good News. So, when I first thought of this, I said to myself, okay, they've done a book on creation, and they've done a book on the flood, and now they're going to do a book on the good news, which is probably the story of the fall and salvation. So the good news is the gospel. But when I moved into the book, it seemed to me that maybe you were using the expression good news in a different way. So what is the good news in your book?
Okay, I'm surprised at your question. I thought you were going to come back and say, what exactly are we talking about in the misreading of Genesis? But
We'll get there.
the surprisingly good news was that there isn't a problem between Genesis and science, because that's the task we set ourselves in the foreword to book 1, and it's the task we come back to in the afterword to book 3.
Okay. I almost sensed a sigh of relief on the part of the author, and maybe authors and the readers, that we don't have to be burdened down with this misreading of Genesis that has caused us so much trouble over time. And it struck me as a very deeply existential issue, not just an academic one, but that there's a really important, almost emotional investment in this matter. Am I correct? The
Yes.
matter being the conflict between science and religion, allegedly.
Yes. For those of us that have grown up in Adventism and have elected to pursue science instead of theology, those being the two options that we thought covered the waterfront, it has been a drag on our understanding and our ability to rejoice in the Advent message, because it basically made us second-rate citizens. The people that teach science in our colleges and universities are doctors have kind of escaped, but science teachers definitely are looked upon as troublemakers by and large by administration, or have been. And physicists get away with it. Usually they are considered to be harmless. It's the biologists that are looked down upon, or maybe not looked down upon, looked upon with some sense of misgiving by college and university administrators.
Okay, I'd like to come back to that and ask the question, how should a biologist on an Adventist campus deal with these matters with his or her students? So let's come back to that, because I think that's a very important practical issue. Now, it seems to me that, quite surprisingly, these 3 books drive as wide a wedge as possible between our understandings of the universe and the text. There's a tendency, I think, for people to try to harmonize them and smooth over the differences. But not only do you distinguish them, but you really hammer away at that. Just boom, boom, boom. It's a recurring theme throughout all 3 books, that we must understand that these are different. And we must not think that when we're reading Genesis, we're reading anything of the sort that we have in mind. So can you talk about that sense of urgency and intensity you have about this?
Well, that's the reason would be the one that one of the major reasons would be the one I just cited. It has led to this rift between science teachers on Adventist campuses, particularly biology science teachers on Adventist campuses, and between the scientists in a congregation and many of our local churches, except perhaps less so in our colleges and on the East and West Coast. But there's always been this view that scientists are treading in dangerous waters and they need to be kept an eye on. And that's why we undertook to try and figure out where this rift between the Bible and between Genesis and science originated from, and whether it was real, whether in fact the Bible was saying things that science really could not support. And the answer is no. It's the mistranslation. We're back now to misread Genesis, which is the second part of the title.
Okay, we're almost there, almost there. I have another question or comment, and that is,
okay,
as I
sure.
observed last week, the book is quite measured throughout, but becomes a little less measured when you talk about creation science and flood geology. And there was a point there that I thought maybe I heard Fritz a little more clearly than I heard you, in a very adamant rejoinder that flood geology, creation science is bad. It should never have started in the first place. And the sooner we stop it, the better. It seemed I could almost hear Fritz say there. Whoever wrote the first lines is not important, but I'd like you to repeat why it is that the tone sort of shifts right there about creation science and flood geology. Now, I'm not talking about how people are treated on the campus. I'm talking about these two things, because we know that on our campus, there are distinguished people who, on their own accord, get involved and are involved in creation science and flood geology and believe they're making progress on that front. But every cent spent, every dollar, I'll say, every dollar spent that way is a dollar ill spent, I gather.
I don't know that we were quite that. But generally speaking, I would agree that the tone of the books is that this should never have started in the first place. And Adventists and Adventism has, as you are well aware, contributed in very large measure to the flowering of creation science and flood geology. And we set about, and that's contributed to the rift between science as commonly understood and Genesis as usually read. Let's underscore that, usually read. So we set about to try and help readers of Genesis to read it as unusually read, to read it as it was intended to be read by the people for whom it was written. That Genesis was written in a two-explanacept world to be read by people whose minds were equipped with two explanacepts and who didn't possess the third explanacept that we think, and we hope we've made our case, has brought about the division between science and Genesis. So that's what we set out to do, and that's why maybe we did get, in answer to your question, who wrote what, it was a wonderful experience writing with Fritz, because our sentences, although there were minor differences, after I had done a first draft and he had edited it, or he had done a first draft and I had edited it, we couldn't tell most of the time who had actually written which sentence. So it was an unalloyed pleasure to work with a person who wrote and thought that similarly. So I can't tell you who wrote But, clearly if it was straight theology, it was probably Fritz. If it's straight science, but if it was the mixture, we won't be able to sort it out.
Well, if you can't sort it out, I better not try to sort it out myself, because that means they were integrated very well. Let's go back then to your book, number 3, and you've talked about the good news, and now let's talk about the misreading of Genesis. What would you like to say about that?
Well, just that the entire 3 books were on the topic, but book number 3, we go into great detail as to the various ways. In the several chapters, we talk about the various ways in which Genesis can be and has been misread. And one of those ways was, for instance, Genesis is misread today in creation science and in flood geology as describing a heliocentric reality. Nobody who participates in these disciplines would deviate from the idea that what Genesis is describing is a heliocentric reality. Everything in reality, in cosmology anyway, is heliocentric. We live in a heliocentric reality in which the Earth is tiny. It circles a huge sun, whose gravity vastly exceeds that of the Earth and holds it in orbit. The Earth rotates around on its axis. The Earth moves around the sun, and they don't actually read Genesis for what it says. Genesis was written and needs to be read in a geocentric reality, just like the geocentric reality of Luther 2,000 or 1,500 years later. Moshe's reality was thoroughly geocentric. The sun went round the Earth. It went over as the firmament turned. The sun went over the Earth in the day, and somehow or other, you saw the problem the sun would have getting through the foundations of the Earth. It wasn't at all clear how it managed, but it did. And every morning it came up and it moved, and the Earth was stationary. And the fact that the Earth was stationary was proof of God's power. God was God because he had made the Earth and it would never be moved. Well, it's odd, and we found it, the more we thought about it, the odder we thought it was, that most Adventists in this day and age read that same text, and they read it as supporting a heliocentric reality. So that was just one of the illustrations that we put into the book to illustrate how badly Genesis has been misread and the kinds of problems that misreading has caused us.
Yes, and I'm persuaded that the painting from Luther's Bible is as conclusive evidence as there possibly could be as to what the people that far down in history thought.
That was only 1,500 years ago, and it was just 10 years before the heliocentric reality began to worm its way into human consciousness. 100 years later, pretty much everybody was living in a heliocentric universe or heliocentric solar system. We asked ourselves the question, and don't know that we ever got an answer, but we concluded that it's probably impossible for anyone in this day and age to imagine reality other than as heliocentric. That is, if you're going to imagine reality in 3 dimensions, I don't think our minds are capable of imagining it the way it would have been mentally pictured by Moshe. And yet that's what we need to do in order to read Genesis the way it would have been read by Moshe.
Okay. Now, along the way, I'm looking at the table of contents. And along the way, you deal with some related matters. One of them I would like to bring us to is the character of Wycliffe and how he has influenced all the translations subsequent to him.
Well, that was just the question of how to translate edits. Wycliffe translated edits as earth. And at the time that he translated it, because the heliocentric notions had not yet arrived in human consciousness, at the time he translated it, it meant the earth, the dirt under the feet of the animals in Eden. That's why I mentioned, as I was pointing out, Adam and Eve ruling benignly over all of these animals. That was edits. That was what edits meant. Because he translated it as earth, and because 100 years later, all of humankind, all of educated humankind had come into a heliocentric reality, that earth was a very unfortunate choice because it became the planet Earth. And as it became the planet, then the Bible was now read as describing the heliocentric reality in which we all live. So Wycliffe, and I'm sure it was inadvertent on his part, but if he had just simply translated that Eretz as land, as the rest of the Bible translators did, we probably would never have gotten into flood geology.
What I found so remarkable about that is how not all, but many of the subsequent translations just followed Wycliffe on this, and perhaps on many other items. Many of the translations subsequently to that, which I thought would have been more independent of Wycliffe, seem to have kept quite closely to his translation. Were you surprised by that?
No, Fritz assured me that translators and Bible scholars of that ilk are inherently conservative, and they'll move as little as they have to between one translation and the next. And that's been true down through the last several hundred years. Almost all of the translations are described as updating the previous ones. The only ones that started de novo in recent years, that I'm aware of at least, were the New English Bible and of course the paraphrastic translations. But the rest of the translations are often refer back to quote the King James or the Authorized Version and then update it.
That's remarkable. Now, one detail with regard to the creation story, I'd like to go back to that just for a moment, because I've read some from Richard Davidson at Andrews University in the interlude, and he holds that linguistically there is a gap between the first and second parts of Genesis. If I remember correctly, you were doubtful of that, and he's a little sensitive on it because he has, I guess the suggestion has been made that he has come up with that space in order to accommodate longer geological understandings. But he insists on that, no, he has nothing to gain or lose on that front, but he thinks linguistically there is that, at least that possibility, and maybe that necessity to think of a gap between the two parts of Genesis 1:1. Do you want to comment on that further?
Well, it's known as the gap theory, and if God was thought to be doing no further actions in the gap between, you'll have to help me. It's Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1.
Just 1A and B.
Yeah, 1A and B. The gap was put in there, I think, creatively. I don't know by whom, in order to allow for the passage of time, so that there was an initial creation, and then presumably the earth circled the sun in an unformed, unorganized state for eons, and then the creation story begins 6,000 years ago, or a few thousand years ago in the recent past, when God reorganized a planet that was disorganized and had been in a disorganized state ever since the universe had been created sometime previously. But as you will recognize, this doesn't read the creation story as geocentric, and I'm quite convinced that that theologically it has to be read as geocentric, because it was geocentric up through the time of Luther, as I think I've convinced you. You seem to have agreed that the earth at that point in time was viewed as the center of all reality, which means that reality was geocentric.
Yes, you have persuaded me that the painting is beautiful, but it is also persuasive. Now back to this third book, just for a little bit more. You move away from talking about the Bible as a library. You say it's not a book. And earlier in your second book, you referred to it as a library, but here you describe it as a what is it called? Curated collection. Now, why I really like library, but why do we move from library to curated collection?
Well, because the library is fine, and I'm quite happy if you're happy with a library to leave it at that. But a library is a collection of books that have no particular relationship to each other. And it's obvious that the Bible is a collection of separate books that are very definitely related to each other. And that's why we view the whole collection as a book. So to underscore the fact that all the books of the Bible were chosen for inclusion, because the people that chose them found them immeasurably helpful in understanding who God was and what God did and what God wanted for them. That's what binds this curated collection together. So we were just making a sort of embellishment on the term library.
Okay. Now, one of the most important things about your treatment of Scripture is that you view it as dynamic, as that there's movement, there's development, there's progress. That doesn't mean that it's steady or even. Sometimes there's a left and right movement, sometimes there's a loss of progress. But if we step back and look at the whole picture, we can see things moving in a more helpful direction. And you use the expression greater clarity about God. Now that idea of reading the Bible dynamically, I think is not one that's widely expressed, though I think it should be. And I think it's very helpful. And what's interesting to me is that it's not merely the scientific material that you think may become more clear, but if it's down to Luther, it doesn't get very clear, but it's the theological. It's the understanding of God that develops over time. And that is more provocative. I think I agree, but I think we need to say that again and again. So how about explaining that further?
I think you just did an excellent job. And I don't think that Fritz and I thought that the scientific matters became clearer in the Bible. What we were just simply trying to do is to say, we start with, when we read the Bible, we start with what it meant to the people who first read it, and then we take it from there into our lives and decide what it then should and could mean to us. And our concern was that we weren't doing that with Genesis. We were wresting it out of Moshe's realm, and we were bringing it up into the 20th century we were taking a reality that was geocentric and making it thoroughly heliocentric. We were doing all sorts of things with the way in which God was understood to act back in Old Testament times, and putting them into the realm of nature and science. Remember that that God's actions in the time that the Bible, well, the early chapters of the Bible were written. We're talking here about the Old Testament. That God's actions in those times fell into two categories. They fell into the category of what he did routinely. That is, he brought the sun up every morning and he made sure that it got back from the place where it set to the place where it was going to come up. He did everything that people expected him to do. That was routine. Then on occasion he acted exceptionally, and it's those exceptional actions that comprise the biblical theology. You and I had this brief discussion about the great acts of God theology. I'm not sure I understand exactly what that is yet, but so God acted routinely most of the time in the Old Testament. He acted exceptionally some of the time. We need to realize that when we read the Bible, because otherwise we're going to get ourselves confused with bringing all of this up into the modern age and then saying that God acted by means of miracle in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, a miracle was not a category that was understood or would have been useful. A miracle in modern age is God acting supernaturally, God acting in violation of the natural regularities. Well, you can't have God acting in violation of natural regularities until humankind as a group accepts natural regularities. And that, of course, didn't happen until after Luther's time, when science developed and repeatable experiments and empirical data to undergird facts became something that we all expected. So when Fritz and I got to talking about miracle and realized that that term, or even the concept, would have been opaque to Moshe, we decided that that what we were doing was highly worthwhile in areas that we really hadn't expected it to affect.
Okay, in principle, is there any reason why, from your perspective, this development could not continue after the Bible, right down to our own time, such that we might expect some increasing clarity about God 2,000 years after the Bible, as well as 2,000 years before the book of Revelation?
Oh, I think unquestionably that humankind has progressed beyond the close of the biblical record. But unfortunately, it's sort of it strikes me as a random walk. There's 2 steps forward and 2 steps backward. But no, I don't know of any theoretical reason why that would not be expected.
Okay, now we have just a couple of minutes, and I'd like to turn back to Ian and some very practical questions. Let's think of Ian as a member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and he has read that the General Conference in session has revised number 6, fundamental belief number 6, so now he is expected, according to that, to think of these as 24-hour contiguous days, not so long back. Now, what should he do as a member of the church?
Maybe he should write a book about it.
Okay. Yeah. Do you think he's duty bound to hand in his resignation?
By no means, but he's not duty bound to sign up for the. You said you weren't going to sign up for it, even though with a little bit of sophistry you could make it clear to yourself that you weren't violating anything fundamental. No, I don't think he needs to sign up for it or support it. He can try to help the church see more clearly what the Genesis narratives were. And if he's a preacher, he could preach it. If he's a teacher, he could teach it. And if he can write, he should write about it. In fact,
Okay.
if you don't mind, I would like to read the final page where we answered this question.
Please.
When they are read, not as science, but as theology, the Genesis narratives will achieve in the 21st century the purpose for which they were originally written. That purpose was to convey theological understandings about God, understandings that proved so fraught with meaning that they started the Hebrews on a centuries-long quest to achieve ever clearer insights into God's being, God's actions, and God's intentions. In time, records of that quest came to make up the Hebrew Bible, our Old Testament. Genesis begins that Bible and, more than any other writing, provides the basis for a theology of creation. Finite reality is best understood as the gift of a loving God concerned about the flourishing of created reality, especially human reality. Existence itself is a gift for which profound and continuing gratitude in both feeling and action is the only appropriate response. Significantly, feelings of gratitude increase human happiness and thus human flourishing. Furthermore, divine generosity motivates a human sense of responsibility and generosity in return.
That's a perfect place for us to pause for our break. Let's do so, and I will put the YouTube recording on pause. I'll leave the Facebook one on. You're welcome to talk about anything you want. I'll try not to be so fastidious about you not talking about great things during the break. And we'll come back in about 10 minutes. And I'll ask Forrest and Monty and Bronwyn to help me make sure that I turn the recording back on for YouTube. When we come back, maybe we can ask what Ian should do if he is a biology teacher on an Adventist campus, but that's later. Okay, 10 minutes from now, that would make it almost 11:45. That would be about 13 minutes. Let's reconvene at 11:45.
Okay, thank you, David, for your good
Oh,
support, good
thank
support.
you. Thank you very much.
So you finally caught up with me. That's good. So happy birthday. Okay. All right, we can start now after the important announcement is over.
All right, over to you.
Okay. But did you want to ask a question of Brian? You at the end of the last session or last part, you just said about you had a thought about teaching in Adventist schools, or?
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. I wonder if Brian had any thoughts about how a biologist on one of our campuses ought to relate to this.
Well, I feel for them because they are in a difficult situation. In my situation, I was only in a level of administration for 10 years where this was potentially a problem. When I became dean of the School of Medicine at Loma Linda, I had a conversation with General Conference President as to exactly how I was going to talk about things of this sort, because as many of you know, it's been a passion of mine all my life, or at least ever since college days. the agreement that we reached was that I would not talk about this in any official capacity as long as I was dean, and that I wouldn't teach Sabbath school classes and talk about it. I certainly entitled to continue to teach Sabbath school classes. I just wasn't going to talk about this topic, and I wasn't going to write about it because it was felt at the time that as the dean of the largest medical school in the denomination, that it would be inappropriate for me to be this dissimilar to the accepted approach. So a rather humorous event occurred because towards the end of the time I was dean, I was asked to speak at one of the faith and science conferences on, and after a discussion, I said, well, I'll talk about the problems of living in disparate worlds, science during the week and on weekends, having to deal with these kinds of problems. And so when I was asked to speak, I said, well, I'm afraid I can't because I've agreed I won't talk about this as long as I'm dean. Lowell Cooper gave me absolution and said, Brian, we'll release you. We'll release you from your commitment for purposes of giving a talk. But at the end of that talk, there were biologists in the audience who had spent their lives teaching on Adventist campuses. And they came up to me and they had tears in their eyes because I had talked about the difficulty of people on our campuses who find themselves in this situation. So I don't know, I'm not going to give them any advice. I'm just simply saying that for 10 years of my life, I didn't talk about this matter publicly. I had plenty of other things to talk about.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
By the way, David, I have Bob Ford. He kind of has a similar question. Did you want to bring your question up? And then I'll come to Monty.
Now, well, why don't you just go ahead and read it?
Okay. All right, David and Brian, I'm looking forward to our hearing what you say. Biologists in our colleges should teach. A question, is there room for geologists and geographers, earth scientists in our church today?
Well, I would say absolutely, but I understand the situation since I've been both, quote, a troublemaker and an administrator. I understand the situation from both sides. And most of our biologists do not talk about these matters in class, but they're certainly willing and able to talk about them to students who come with questions. I don't know of any biologists who have gotten into difficulty by doing that, but some may have. But I do know that they're not viewed by administration as, well, they're always viewed with a certain sense of misgiving by administrators, because the administrators don't want problems to occur, and these are the people who they are concerned about. I'd be interested in, I see Reinder has joined us, and I'm quite sure he finds himself or found himself as an administrator in a not too dissimilar situation. I'd like to know from him how he dealt with it.
You're okay, there you go.
Well, of course, I have not been in a situation where my convictions on geology and similar topics became a real issue. But I have, by and large, been, I guess, lucky in the sense that I worked together with other administrators in my time that I was in administration, who were somewhat like-minded And so I have never been in real difficulty, although I realize that maybe my career in the church would have been different if I had not been, if I had been a little bit more careful. And that certainly also the last decade or so after I was retired, I might have been invited in different places if I had been talking and thinking differently. I have, for myself, always tried not to be stupid. You know, there's no need to talk about everything to everybody at all times. So there is a certain amount of, I think, care, and there's also, of course, responsibility as to where you talk and to whom you talk. But I have always tried to be honest to myself, and never, when asked about certain things, you know, try to just avoid the issue. I want to be able to look myself in the eyes and say, you know, some people now say, well, you're retired, so it's easy for you. But I hope that people will recognize that that is what I have always tried to do. But I've been lucky also not to live and work in the kind of toxic situation that some others have been working in.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I had the feeling from listening to you talk and recognizing your history in administration that your response would be along those lines. But it is the case that our biologists in many of our institutions of higher education are in fact looked upon with a fair bit of misgiving by administrators for the reasons that Reinder and I have just enunciated.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Reinder. I'd like to go to Monty at this time.
All right, Brian, thank you very much for your presentation today. As Lisa and I have been listening here, we have a question for you. And in Reinder's words, a person who isn't being stupid probably wouldn't do this. But if you had to we're going to teach these concepts in a kindergarten Sabbath school, have you thought about how you would frame this for young people? Because certainly that's where our teaching about creation often begins in our church. And I'm just wondering if, as you look to that group, not just the college group, but a younger group in our church, even though it probably would be very problematic, I'm just wondering how you might approach it, because you've thought about this a lot.
I may have thought about it a lot, but I certainly haven't thought about teaching it to kindergarten. It's not. I've taught Sabbath schools off and on most of my adult life, but never have I taught a kindergarten Sabbath school. So I really haven't given it much consideration. But I think at that level, I would just simply tell the stories the way they've always been told. Noah and the ark and the animals and that sort of thing. I don't think that there would be, I would probably simply tell the stories. These stories have survived because of the fact that they have been enjoyed and have proven beneficial to the kids to whom they were told, and help them deal with situations as they grew up. So at kindergarten, I don't think that any change is needed. But I'm not I have no experience whatever teaching kindergarten.
Well, I guess then my question is, at what point do you start to undo the beliefs that result from the stories? I mean, one thing that could be done is maybe when you're telling the story to a kindergarten, instead of saying earth, you could say ground or dirt or something like that.
Oh, definitely. I would tell the story with land as the translation of Eretz instead of earth, because I think that, yes, if that's your question, yes, I would. See, the problem with the notion that, that, for instance, the flood covered the whole earth is because of the translation of Eretz as earth instead of land. If the story of Noah had been translated and the waters covered all of the land, then it would have been, I think, apparent that this was all of the land that Moshe knew about or had heard about or could conceive of. But it certainly wouldn't have immediately given rise to the notion that the flood was global, which it does now. And once you have the idea that the flood is global, then you immediately run into the problems of, okay, was this water coming from a bypassing comet, or did it come from a hydrologic layer underneath the Earth's surface? Or all of these problems immediately come into clear view by Ian Michael because of the mistranslation of Eretz. So if you're asking, would I tell the story and stay with land? Absolutely.
Okay, and my guess is if you did or I did use that kind of language, we might be maybe the 1 or maybe at most 5% of times that these young children heard the story, they would hear that language versus the flood covering the earth. And so then I've seen a few others have mentioned this. At what point do we start transitioning students to a more sophisticated understanding and helping them see it as land, not as the whole earth? Because what I'm hearing with kindergartners, we just tell the story, and I think I would agree with you. But at some point, what you're describing is helping students to understand that it's not the whole earth, that it actually is the land. That's what Moshe understood. So I just think it's an interesting concept, and certainly a big part of our challenge, because as you've been talking about, there's not an acceptance of even presenting that to our medical students, or to our college students. So how tolerant is the church going to be of our elementary children or our high school students hearing that sort of a message? We're kind of stuck.
Well, recently, it's my understanding that the high school and maybe K through 12 textbooks have been revised to emphasize the creation story. And I don't know if that's the case or not, but if it is, then I would hope that some of these misleading translations would be eliminated in the process. But I'm not expecting that will be the case. I'm just hopeful that if they are going to redo it, that some of these mistranslations that have led to so much controversy and so many hard feelings and so much distress in terms of how science relates, how scientists relate to the church generally. I would hope that we're heading in a more positive direction, but I'm not sure that we are.
Yeah, thank you, Brian.
Great, thank you, Monty. I want to go to Rod Corker. I'm going to put you in the stumps now. Is that a cricket term?
Yes, it is, and maybe I will get stumped right here.
Oh, okay.
Firstly, I want to say thank you, Brian, for such a vast source of information. And I regret, as I said, not reading the books and also being absent from Sabbath school for a couple of weeks. And I certainly don't want to get it into covering ground that has already been covered. But my understanding is that a contemporary Ian Michael would be fed by information from the History Channel, for example. He would be fed by information from the intelligent design body of people, archaeologists that are Assyrianologists and interpreting the cuneiform language that's been discovered in the last couple of 100 years and interpreted that take us way, way beyond Luther in contemporary understanding of even the 4 flood events. And so I'll make an offer, if I'm not being repetitive, to Dave. I've done and have been working on for many months a compare and contrast of the 4 different stories of the flood or the Great Delusion. I've tried to pull out of that the underpinnings for the Hebrew version and where there are commonalities and work that into some kind of theology. And in doing so is part of the reason why I consider myself a refreshed and reinvigorated God believer. I could also probably work in there the cosmology, and there's only one civilization that really had an attempt at this, and this was the black-headed Sumer people from Eden. And I have read commentaries on that, and that might be of interest to some. But that is also the underpinnings of a lot of what is carried forward and we understand and can pull out of the cuneiform scripts. So if that's a subject matter that would be interesting, Dave, to the people, then 3 weeks notice and I'll be prepared to do that. And I would do that from the perspective of archaeology in the last 200 years, intelligent design theorists to summarize where they are with it, and my own refreshing of my belief in it, God.
For sure, Rodney. I've invited you to work on a different project, but let's put that project aside for a while and then have you work on this one because you've already been doing work on it. And let's get together and schedule you sometime in January. All right.
Okay.
Now,
and I don't
ahead.
want, excuse the pun, but I don't want to drown people in a flood of new information.
Well, we'll see how many weeks you need to do it. I do think that comparing these stories is very, very helpful. I read the Gilgamesh epic again, and the picture of God there is absolutely opposite to what we have in the Bible. Enlil is furious in the Gilgamesh epic, furious that any human being survived. It was his purpose that no human being survived. And he is looking for someone to blame that some human being survived. That's a very, very different picture of God than the one who provides some way of escape for people. Now,
yes, indeed.
I don't think the picture of God we have in this flood story is adequate, but I do think it's better than the Gilgamesh epic. Go ahead.
No, I'm saying, yes, indeed, there are a lot of blatant conflicts, but there are some very important threads, common threads, that you can see where the Hebrew story was built. The Hebrews, most scholars believe that they wrote their story during the exilic period when they're in exile in Babylon. They must have known the Babylon version, and the Babylon version is very similar to the Akkadian. The Akkadians being the early Semitic and the Hebrews being Semitic. They must have known these stories at the time of the writing, and therefore the interesting thing to me is, why did they massage it? Why did they pull some bits, change some bits, and why did they put some other bits way back? And that gets into monotheism, because the people at the time these stories were written were polytheistic. They weren't into monotheism. They had their God, but you could choose your own God. But once Yahweh comes onto the scene, is monotheism. Monotheism it comes into play, and it's going to shape the narrative.
Good.
Okay, thank you. I want to go to Peter at this time. Peter?
Thank you for the presentation. Two things I want to talk about. First, about the problems, the pain that the biology teachers have in our schools and universities. We're talking first mainly about the theory of evolution, that they have problems presenting it, because I don't see any problem, major problem with this. Not only the Adventist scientists, but I heard many non-Adventist scientists that do not agree with Darwin. This is a theory. It's not set in stone because the only explanation how the life appeared. Then why these biology teachers have such a big problem explaining? Why they cannot say just this is a theory? This is a way, one way to explain it, but there are some other ways to explain it. That is one. The second thing, last time after the recording was interrupted, I raised the problem, and I'd like to hear other opinions. How do you explain this? How do you see it? The problem is that I raise is the discovery of marine fossils on the highest top of the mountains. How can this be explained?
Well, let me answer the second question first. You're quite correct. There are marine fossils high up on many of the Earth's highest mountains. The explanation that's given is that tectonic uplift produces mountains from layers that are sedimentary. We're talking now about mountains that are not volcanic. In the case of volcanoes, I think it's obvious that you're not going to find fossils pretty much anywhere on volcanic mountains. But if the mountains are made of sedimentary rock, which many of the Earth's highest mountains are, then it's going to be composed of whatever was in the layers before the uplift began. And in many cases, there's limestone, which may or may not be fossiliferous, but in many cases did arise from deep ocean deposits. So yes, you're perfectly correct. There are definitely fossiliferous layers on many of the Earth's highest mountains. And that's where many of the fossils are collected from, because in the uplift, the layers are fractured, and paleontologists can find the fossils because of the fractures caused by mountain uplift. As for the biologists, I'm sorry, I didn't catch exactly what your phrase was. What did you say? Could you repeat the question? Because maybe my connection's not good, but I didn't understand what it was.
I said I don't see the pain and the problems that the biology teachers in Adventist schools and university have with explaining the theory of evolution of Darwin. Because there is not only one way to explain it. First of all, there are a lot of scientists that do not agree with Darwin. And they bring solid arguments that Darwin was wrong in the way he explained the origin of life. Then,
now I understand the question. That's not where the problems arise. The problems arise in how old the Earth is. Did in fact mountains come up from sedimentary layers over eons of time, or and the second problem is, did all life originate together? That is, were dinosaurs and human beings contemporaneous, and did all life originate a few thousand years ago? That's sort of where the rubber meets the road. The theory of evolution is very much under discussion by everybody And there are no, to my knowledge, there's no real settled opinion on that matter. It's the time frame and biology in the sense of animal life. Did species become extinct, or did dinosaurs and humans coexist?
Okay, all right, thank you, thank you. I want to go to John Jones. You have a question in the chat. Would you ask your question, John?
Well, thank you, Forrest. I was only engaging in the chat. I don't need,
Okay.
I don't mean to beat this drum as part of the larger conversation, but Robert Ford is asking us a helpful question, one that flows naturally from our conversation. You can read there in the chat. He's asking, how do we explain to older students that these stories are not exactly true? That's a fair question, and it's an important one, and we've talked a little about it. I was only interjecting a clarifying moment in which I was simply saying to Bob, but since he wrote to everyone, I included everyone, in what sense not exactly true? Historical veracity in the technical sense has only emerged in the last couple of centuries as a separate order of meaning, as a criterion of truth. And I think that that's worth bearing in mind when we ask what kind of truth, what is the truth that the ancient narratives, and particularly Genesis 1, are intended to convey. Now, anybody wants to pick that up and run with it, they're welcome to, but that's all I'll say for the moment.
Let me go back then to the paragraph that I read just at the conclusion of our last session and read it again, because the answer that we were proposing as to the question that has been asked reads as follows. When they are read not as science, but as theology, the Genesis narratives will achieve in the 21st century the purpose for which they were originally written. That purpose was to convey theological understandings. Remember, they were not written as science. They could not have been. Science didn't exist. The purpose was to convey theological understandings about God, understandings that proved so fraught with meaning that they started the Hebrews on a centuries-long quest to achieve ever clearer insights into God's being, God's actions, and God's intentions. In time, records of that quest came to make up the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah, precisely, exactly the point. And one of the implications of that is that, for example, during my years in administration on campuses, I have had occasion to say to biology professors, when you are feeling that you're being cornered on some of these issues, you are justified in referring them to the theology department and the theology faculty. That's not inviting them, scientists, to wash their hands, but I think it's a helpful move in that it clarifies in students' minds the difference between these two great magisteria, as they've sometimes been called.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I would like to ask you a question, Brian, if I may. First, before I do that, I'd like to preface it by saying biologists are not the only ones that are under microscope. We also have theologians that are under microscopes. We have Adventist historians who are under microscopes. And I just wonder if the church is kind of getting into a bind where we're not allowing not just free thought, but open thought in regards to these areas. Otherwise, what we're having in our higher education are nothing more than Bible schools.
Yeah, yeah. We are, those of us who are on the front lines are only on the front lines. Sooner or later, people in almost every discipline are going to find themselves under fire if we allow it to develop.
Yeah, well, I use the expression is I only preach what I believe, but I don't preach everything I believe. And I think there's a merit in not upsetting some people, but when you're in university, I think it's time to be given a full plate full of stuff. Thank you. And let me ask you, but my question I wanted to ask you, Brian, is how has been the non-Adventist world looking at your and Fritz's material? Have they had a chance to review it?
No, not after the final volume was published. The world went into shutdown because of the COVID pandemic, and basically I haven't heard much of anything in terms of response. Very, very little.
Okay.
From anybody.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. McKinley.
Thank you, Forrest. Before I get to Dr. Bull, I just want to thank Monty for his important question about how to reflect some of these new understandings in our children's Sabbath school divisions. I think it's something that needs to be looked at. Dr. Bull, I'm sorry to hear about your censorship experience. I think it's helpful in our university settings to allow free exchange.
I don't mean to come across, I didn't feel hard done by. I understood from the administrative point of view that this was probably the wisest course, and I certainly had many other challenges to confront me besides this one. It's just that I took for 10 years, I didn't talk about it, and I don't consider that an unusual hardship in any degree.
All right. But thank you for your important contribution to the Genesis question. Thank you also for reading the last page of your book. I found that edifying. Here are a couple of important observations and then a question later. Your presentations over the last 3 weeks point out more need for research, including correcting some of the mistranslations or misinterpretations of scripture. And I think Dr. Taylor in his some of his prior presentations have pointed out the need for that sort of thing when he talked about, I'm not going to pronounce this the right way. I think that the tagnums or the tagrams and then the supplied words, he also used a technical term for the supplied words that I'm not recalling right now. But my sense about the struggle most people have with the role of God in cosmology is the lack of knowledge of some of the possible pathways to the outcomes presented. The two biggest areas being the creation in, as David described it, 24-hour contiguous periods, and the resurrection. Conceptually, thermodynamically, it is possible that there are pathways to some of these outcomes. And by this reasoning, there is no conflict, in my thinking, between the big picture reading of Genesis, the boundary conditions, and the observed universe. Two fundamental equations support this view. And again, this is my engineering sort of processing of what's out there. And so the question that arises from this, or before I ask the question, the two big equations are the definition of work, which is W is equals to force times distance. And then the equation that describes the energy of a resonant cavity. I'm not going to go into those two things, but except to refer to one equation that most people are familiar with, E is equals to mc squared, which they think is the most important relationship, but it really isn't. The work definition, force times distance, is the most important relationship because E equals to MC squared can be derived from that. But having said that, how might your books be updated with a thermodynamic perspective as another sort of a framing of your expansonists?
The expansonists were introduced not to explain the kinds of questions that you are dealing with, and appropriately so with thermodynamic investigations. The expansonists were introduced to make concrete the difference between the way Genesis was written and intended to be read initially and the way in which we read it today, and all of the things that have fallen off the shelf as a result of not understanding that. There's a chapter in this last book that is entitled, "Is Genesis," I don't know what the title is, but it's I think it's abbreviated literal or figurative, and it addresses the question, should Genesis be read literally or should it be read, it's chapter 11, literal, figurative, dash, both or neither. And ultimately, that's sort of what we come down to. Is Genesis to be read literally? Because to the extent that it has been and continues to be in a 3-explanacept world, it gives rise to the problems that the books were intended to address. If it's read figuratively, it gives rise to a whole nother set of problems. And that question can't be answered as long as we stick with those two possible answers. Ours was that Genesis was written and intended to be read literally, but by people who wrote it and people who read it with 2-explanacept minds. If Genesis was intended to be read literally about God's working in the world and his power, and is read with only 2-explanacepts in mind, then the problems that we have been fussing about and that Fritz and I spent, I guess, 15 years or so producing these 3 books, those problems disappear. So Genesis was intended to be read literally, but by people with 2-explanacept minds. And of course, that meant that they didn't have science. They only had God's actions and human actions. And Genesis, if read that way, tells us what Genesis was intended to tell us about God's actions, God's intentions, and God's being. That is what our 3-book series was intended to convey. And we spent an entire chapter on that particular question.
And at this point, I wish you and Dr. Taylor could be given extended lives of 50 or more years to build on your work, because then I would encourage a 4th iteration of your book that would include some of these new thermodynamic concepts, including entropy-free space-time, Markov chain implications, and so on and so forth. But thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I'd like to go to Donna. Are you there, Donna? I see Donna's hand up, but okay.
Can you hear me?
Now we can. Thank you, Donna.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I'm a techno idiot of sorts.
We can hear you.
Okay. I'd like to go back just briefly to what Monty and then later McKinley referred to. I guess the pediatrician comes out. I think the teaching of these stories to children is extremely important, and the impoverishment of adult imagination as well as child imagination would be really great if we stopped doing it. At least teach Noah and the ark and Jonah and the whale. I'm not sure about Job. That's a little tougher story, I think, for children. But what can I say? How could you ever read literature? How could you read Shakespeare or Donne or any of the? How would you know about fairies if you're not taught some things that are imaginary but carry truth in their hands that you keep through life? So I agree with Brian. I would tell them the stories as we've been taught. And as far as when you begin the transition to saying, well, no, Jonah really wasn't swallowed by a whale. That's just a story that somebody made up to explain the importance of mercy and repentance. When they begin to ask those questions, that's when you start to fashion answers. And I don't think it's necessary to go back to Cradle Roll and try to modify the stories at this point. Sorry to go from thermodynamics to Cradle Roll, but
thank you, Donna. I appreciate that transition. I think that I feel more secure in Cradle Roll than in thermodynamics myself.
That's great, Donna.
I do think that if someone teaches the Cradle Roll, they'll understand thermodynamics a little better, that they don't run down all the time. So anyway, David, I've got one hand up, a repeat. We're getting close to the bewitching hour. Did you want me to take this question, or did you want to?
Yes, I see it's Peter. Let's let him ask his question or make his comment, then we'll call it a day. Is that okay? What do you think?
Yeah, fine with you, Peter. Go.
I will be very, very quick. It will be very any help if in our discussions we just say that the Bible doesn't tell how God created. It's telling that God created. And the science try to explain how the things came in existence. There are two different things. Again, the Bible explains only that God created. The science try to explain how the things are working. One Jewish scholar once said that the difference between science and religion is that science takes the things apart, trying to explain how they work. And the theology is putting the things together to show what they mean. Will this explaining in this way will help in any way our discussion?
Brian,
Yes.
do you want to respond to that?
No, I agree completely. I think that's a succinct summation.
Do you have anything more you'd like to say before we conclude this session and this series?
No, the only thing that I wanted to be sure that I got in at the end, I've read twice. So it's the paragraph that talks about why we wrote the books and what we hope to accomplish. And it explains why we dedicated the books to our grandchildren. And the dedication reads, let me get it here. To our grandchildren and their generation, in the hope that Genesis will bring meaning to them as it has brought meaning to us and to our generation, meaning that science is unable to provide.
Well, again, you have given us the perfect place to conclude. So let's do that. Here's the benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Brian, for an excellent presentation.
Thank you, Brian. I really think from a geographer and a geologist on the edges, still trying to decide how to stay